Welcome, my dear students, to our session today. It's biology lesson for the Form 4 class. Our topic today is reception, response, and cognition, and our subtopic will deal with reflex action, types of different reflex actions. In our previous lesson, we discussed the central nervous system and the subdivision of cranial nerves and the brain. So this more or less is a continuation of the same concepts. By the end of the lesson, you'll be expected to be in a position to distinguish between simple and conditioned reflex actions. So those are two types of reflexes you'll be expected to be able to distinguish and to give an explanation between the two. Now, we need to look at what we are referring to as a reflex action. Now, a reflex action is a rapid, automatic response to a certain stimulus. So the key word is it's a rapid, automatic response. At the same time, it must be evoked by a particular stimulus. So there are two types of reflex actions, which we refer to as one, the simple reflex action, and the conditional reflex action. In a simple reflex action, we are saying that it's a rapid, automatic response to a stimulus shown by an organ. Now, reflex actions do not involve the brain for their initiation. So whenever a reflex is taking place, the brain is not in position to initiate that kind of response. No wonder you're calling it an automatic response. So your brain has no control over that. So in a simple reflex action, there's a specific single and automatic response to a particular response. It is the simplest form of reflex and does not depend on learning. So learning is not an issue when it comes to this kind of action being undertaken. Most reflex actions, also known as reflexes, are necessary for the survival of an organism within its environment. Now, all we are saying is that whenever a simple reflex occurs, it is actually an automatic response to a particular change within the environment, which provokes the stimulus that invokes the particular response to be undertaken by an organism. And consequently, we are saying that it is actually necessary for the survival of a particular organism. Now, we have different examples of reflex actions. There are quite many, and very common ones. The very common is when we withdraw a finger from a hot. For example, when you touch a hot frying pan, you withdraw your arm very fast. That's an example. Or sometimes you're walking barefooted, and then you step on a thorn. So when you lift your feet from the breaking thorn, that's another example of reflex action. You can also give an example of the blinking of the eye when somebody passes an object close to the eye. There is a very common aspect of coughing and sneezing. Those two are also examples of simple reflex actions. And sometimes when there's a common knee jerk when the knee is tapped. So when you sit down and somebody taps your kneecap, there is that sudden jerking of the leg. That is also another kind of a simple reflex action. We also have salivation, maybe in anticipation to eat food. When you salivate, that's another reflex action, automatic, simple. And then there's also secretion of tears. For example, when somebody is cooking, you are chopping off the onions, and then your eyes starts to shed tears. That is actually a reflex action. Swallowing is another example, and also the enlargement of the pupil in different light intensities. So those are very common examples of reflex actions. The structural basis of a reflex action is actually called the reflex arc. So this one is the pathway. We call it a reflex arc. It is actually the path or the pathway by which the reflex occurs. It is the simplest reflex act. It's actually made up of 3 neurons. Again, the receptors, sensory, relay, and motor neurons. So they link the receptors, the effectors, through the spinal cord. So this is a simple overview of what we refer to as the stimulus response pathway. Of course, we begin with the stimulus that evokes the response. In this case, we have somebody who is thirsty, and then this is the eye. So this person is able to see the water in a glass. So for this fellow to take water, this is what is evoking the receptor, so that the eyes receives, perceives the light, sees the glass of water. The message is transmitted via the sensory neuron, of course with the optic nerve from the eye connected to the brain, to the central nervous system, where we have the embedded relay neuron that further transmits the same response via a motor neuron to your muscles, the biceps of the arm, where instead of the effectors actually you add muscles of the biceps that now evokes the response by causing your arm to flex, and you lift the glass of water and you can quench your thirst. So that's a simple overview of a simplified stimulus response pathway that necessitates the different kind of reflex that we have. Now, when it comes to a simple reflex, for example, what you have is an example of somebody who is who's got his arm. For example, you accidentally touch a candle, a hot candle. You touch the flame. That's the source of heat. Okay, and then what happens that you perceive the pain receptors in your palm will actually get stimulated. So the pain is actually transmitted via the sensory neuron all the way to your central nervous system. Basically, the signal is passed along the relay neuron to the brain. So the green is the relay neuron, while the red one represents our sensory neuron. Now, within the central nervous system, the sensory impulse is integrated as pain that is now being relayed back via the motor neuron to your biceps or the flexing muscles in your arm, such that you'll be able to flex your arm and remove your fingers from the source of it and avoid that kind of pain. So you can see this actually what happens, a simple pathway or the reflex act what we're talking about. Now in the next slide we are going to watch a simple animation of the same process being repeated in that. So this is the source of it, not the arm. This is the signal, the impulse all the way, once again, to the brain, to the muscle. And what happens? Your arm is lifted up. It is actually flexed, so that you are able to move your arm. So you have the motor neuron, the blue one, this one here. You have the relay neuron, the green one here, within the central nervous system, and the sensory, the one that's linking your arm all the way to that. So that's a simple illustration of the simple reflex action taking place. Other examples just mentioned again, the breaking of a finger when it is actually stimulated. The finger is pricked, the pain receptors, the skin of the fingers will get stimulated. The nerve impulses are triggered off and transmitted through the sensory neuron to the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now the impulse is then transmitted to the relay neuron via a synapse, then to the motor neuron through another motor synapse. Eventually, through the ventral root, the impulse is transmitted to the effectors, which is the biceps of the upper arm, and the biceps contracts and the forearm is withdrawn or raised from the source of pain, whether be it a thorn or even a hot pan. We now look at the next type of reflex action, which is referred to as conditioned reflex. A conditioned reflex is an automatic response which can be evoked by an animal or, by an unrelated stimulus substituted for the one which normally elicits the response. Now, this reflex action is formed from past experience and involves modification of behavior through learning. So, examples of a simple reflex action. Now, if you take the case of a dog normally salivates when it sees food being presented to it. But if a bell is rung just before the food is presented to the dog, and the procedure is repeated several times, the dog will learn to associate the bell ringing with food. Therefore, it will actually salivate as soon as it hears the bell, whether food is present or not. So all we are seeing is this is a process of conditioning. So it's an experiment that was actually carried out by a Russian psychologist, Ivan Pavlov actually carried this. So it is more of a conditioning, we call it classical conditioning. In the first instance, before programming or conditioning this dog, we have the food and the dog. So before this kind of a response, whenever the dog sees food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, it actually produces salivation, which is also unconditioned response. But before conditioning, that can also be changed. Now, what happens here is that if introduce a bell or even a whistle, somebody blows a whistle, that's a neutral stimulus. That means, how does the dog respond? There is no salivation, which means no conditioned response. If you go another step further, you pair. Now, during conditioning, you pair the whistle or the bell with food. What will happen is that quickly the dog sees the food and hears the whistle, it actually salivates. That becomes unconditioned response. Now, after conditioning now, whereby the dog has been used to the aspect of a whistle blowing or a bell being rung and the food being presented at the same time, what will happen is that after conditioning, if the whistle or the bell is rung without presenting the food, the dog will automatically salivate. Now that now becomes what we're referring to as conditioned response. In this case, the bell or the whistle becomes our conditioned stimulus. So for conditioned response, a conditioned stimulus is normally present. You pair the stimulus to evoke the expected response. So this, as I mentioned earlier, was an experiment that was carried out by a Russian psychologist, Ivan Pavlov, who actually did this experiment. He actually called the response conditioned reflex action. The conditional reflex usually weakens with time, so it becomes weaker, and therefore it has to be reinforced by repeated stimulus or repeating the signal, the original experience, if the same results is to be obtained. So the disadvantage of this kind of a response that with time the reflex gets to wear off, and it may not be reinforced. It may not persist for long. So it has to be reinforced by constant practice, which we are calling reinforcement by repeated stimulus or repeating the same original experience, so it can be able to achieve the same results. So conditioned reflex actually forms the basis of learned behavior. A very good example is walking. When you learn walking, you have to keep on practicing how to play a piano, writing, cycling, swimming, driving, and all those. So most of these activities that you normally partake, driving, swimming, cycling, writing, and all those. So they are based on conditional reflex, because if we don't keep on practicing, then we are bound to forget this kind of behavior, and we may have an issue trying to keep it up with that. Now, there are different applications, everyday applications of conditional reflex, and the very common ones actually include training of dogs, learning processes, like we are doing right now. Constant revision is actually learning process, and we are literally using the idea of conditional reflex. We also have advertisements. Repeated advertisements try to win your memory by conditioning what you actually know. So that random repetition is what keeps you to like the particular product, or possibly come up with a different idea about whatever product is being sold. Lastly, we are looking at the differences between simple reflex and the conditional reflex. Very importantly, simple reflex we mentioned is single stimulus, which really brings about a response, whereas conditional reflex is a repeated stimulus. So here we have repetition of the stimulus at a condition, whereas in simple reflex, it is just a single stimulus that brings the response. Then simple reflex is the simplest form of behavior, and it is not affected by the experience, whereas conditioned involves modification of the behavior and is dependent upon the experience. We mentioned that for it to be prolonged, then we have to reinforce the experience to get the same results as previously obtained. Lastly, simple reflex, we have sensory and motor components that are the same at all times, whereas in conditioned reflex, primary sensory component is replaced by a secondary sensory component, but the motor component remains unchanged. So in a conditional reflex, we are varying the sensory component by, for example, introducing the aspect of a bell ringing or blowing a whistle with phone. So when we pair the two and remove one of the two, the primary component is actually removed, leaving what we find as a secondary component, for example, a bell or a whistle, and therefore it can be able to produce the evoked response that brings about our change. That brings us the end to our session today. Thank you.